Hello and welcome to our program. My name is Thorin Tritter. I'm the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County, located in Glen Cove, New York. We have an important program this afternoon with Dr. Elana Heideman, a scholar and educator who's going to speak about the way in which Holocaust history is often misused, undermining public understanding of the Holocaust and its lessons. Elana completed her undergraduate degrees in Judaic Studies and Psychologies at the University of Maryland before earning a master's and doctorate at Boston University, where she studied with Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel. She worked for a number of years with the B'nai B'rith Youth Organization before establishing Links in the Chain, an organization dedicated to Holocaust education, through which she developed programs for groups of all ages on matters relating to the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, Zionism, and Jewish heritage. In 2010, she was named as the executive director of the Israel Forever Foundation that provides experiential learning opportunities to celebrate and strengthen the connection with the land, history, and heritage of the Jewish people in the nation of Israel. Today, she will be talking about the universalization and contemporary abuse of Holocaust history. One more comment before I pass the virtual stage to Dr. Heideman, and that is to remind you and encourage you, if you have questions during her presentation, to use the Q&A feature of Zoom and type those questions, and then we will make time for some discussion after her presentation. Okay, well, those words of introduction, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Elana Heideman to the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County. Elana?
Thank you so much for having me. It's so wonderful to know that there are institutions like yours in every nook and cranny that are helping to provide some really important and meaningful learning experiences for your community. So thank you very, very much for inviting me to join you tonight. The topic that we're addressing, as was mentioned, is the universalization and contemporary abuse of Holocaust history. What was once a sacred and respected realm of human suffering and atrocity, shrouded in the immense pain and brutality of its truth, has now become fodder for common conversations and comparisons in classrooms. With the growing disappearance of survivors, we've received as well the fading of the mystification that once protected the integrity of the Holocaust as a historical event with lessons for all of mankind. Unfortunately, those lessons have been distorted, blurred, manipulated for the purposes of political gain, social justice, and an overly generalized understanding of what the Holocaust was and what it means for humanity today. These are issues of very serious concern for anyone interested in the future of Holocaust memory and the protection of its historical truths. The future role of the Holocaust in public and in private discourse is going to be determined by this cycle of transformation. Not the events, not their context, not the experiences of the primary victims of the Holocaust matter anymore. There are newer, more modern atrocities to shock and revile us, and there is nothing so sacred about the murder of some unverifiable number of Jews that protects it from widespread misrepresentation and misuse. There is no one organization, body, or group that owns the Holocaust or its memory, or that can protect it from the infiltration of those forces, and only a concerted effort to negate the trends will really have any impact on the future. But sadly, there's a lack of coordination and cooperation that has fostered an imbalance, let's say, of what are considered accepted truths about the Holocaust. When the Jewish world is so fragmented, shattered by the wide spectrum of differences in what we each believe about Jewish identity, Jewish history, Jewish values, the Holocaust is a shared element of reference that then gets applied wherever it feels fitting in every direction that someone wants to apply it. The differences of opinion and widespread feeling of ownership or belonging to the Holocaust have actually weakened our ability to contend with the realities that now present themselves. They're on every platform and they are in every scenario. The Holocaust is a joke, a mere moment in history that's no longer relevant unless it's through an exaggerated comparison, terms of reference that have lost all depth and all substance. Everything is open to debate. Everything was requiring subjective analysis. Every element of the Holocaust in particular diminished to a simplicity that outright defies the horrific reality that we know it was. Open-ended comparisons in the classrooms and on campuses have led to generalizations about the Holocaust from which historical memory may never actually recover. What was happening a decade ago or 2 decades ago, it's now exacerbated in every learning realm that exists. There are no limits there to how much we can impose boundaries on forms of presentation or representation, not in films or fiction, not in classrooms, curriculums, anywhere. When it comes to teaching and learning about the Holocaust, just as much as we cannot control the growing genre of these fictional pieces that actually deny factual truths entirely. Many of them justify the behaviors of the murderers. They ignore the innocence of the victims, or they excuse it away because they're Jews, to the extent that the humanizing of the Nazi is simultaneous with the revival of the dehumanization of the Jew, the stripping of the Jew of their place in the history and in its memory. Comparisons that bear no resemblance to the events as they were lived actually trivialize the experience. They diminish the value of the true lessons that the Holocaust can teach. And many of us have been exposed to its good, but we might have also witnessed some of the negative downward spiral that we are seeing really come alive everywhere around us today. Contemporary applications of language, which was once you couldn't say hunger without knowing that it didn't really define hunger. Well, these languages are now being used to describe events and purposes that are completely unrelated to it. More often than not, the information that's being shared about the Holocaust actually strips the truth out of it so that it's clean, it's easy, it's palatable, pain-free, and actually devoid of the Jews that unfortunately make the learners very uncomfortable and really are believed to have no unique experience of persecution, hate, or suffering. Therefore, the Jew also has no special right to the history, the memory, the lessons, and any understanding that could be gained, or even a right that can be granted to the Jewish nation. There is a lot of backlash for the reparations that have been offered to Holocaust survivors because of the claim that the Jews didn't have it so bad. Many new exaggerations that have emerged since the rhetoric has been given free rein throughout social platforms in particular. Unfortunately, amidst the cancel culture that we're living in, Jewish significance is being canceled right alongside the denial of Jewish connection to Jerusalem, to the Temple Mount, to the land of Israel. Even to say that the Holocaust, like Israel, is an integral part of Jewish identity isn't really entirely accurate because it has to have a disclaimer. How does one relate to the Holocaust? How does one relate? What political siding do you have? Do you apply your lessons in the most universal way possible? While educators in museums, parents and grandparents even strive to teach the many faceted elements of the events that's transpired, there are also the voices of second and third generation descendants of survivors of the Holocaust that are channeling their personal family experiences to advance contemporary desires and causes of interest. So like politicians and activists from every side, ghettos, Nazis, concentration camps, and Auschwitz are now the easiest point of comparison from which one can direct accusation and outrage. The newest trend, the use of yellow stars of David and calls of COVID cost, casting the handling of the global pandemic as the modern day Holocaust, and quarantine being just like the experiences of Anne Frank hiding from the Nazis. These are promoted among the very groups we would hope know the boundaries that we should be obliged out of respect to the dead, out of respect to the historical truth, using their privilege as Jews and as descendants of survivors. These voices have become the leaders of movements ranging from activists against the silent Holocaust of the vaccine to, if not now, calling for the destruction of Israel, calling for essentially another Holocaust of Jews, but under the more palatable mantra of anti-Zionism and anti-Israelism. There is a very serious issue of Jewish Holocaust privilege that is increasingly rationalized through open dialogue. And on social media, we see it really take full force, as well as among colleagues and peers in the workplace, but those are rarely reported because of the shame or embarrassment that the people who witness them feel. Nobody wants to share that they heard it and maybe didn't say anything because they simply didn't know what to say. But it is arousing a very scary new version of hatred and resentment against Jews that people are excusing away. I don't really hate all Jews. I just hate these Jews. So, for example, in a group that is of people coping with post-traumatic stress disorder, there's a woman who's in her 20s and made the claim that she had a complex issue of trauma, post-traumatic stress, due to the generational, please excuse me, trauma from her great-grandparents who were concentration camp survivors. So a fellow member of the group claimed, I know I shouldn't care, but it feels like you're just using this as an otherwise privileged woman to claim sympathy for a trauma that isn't even your own. So now the idea of generational trauma being transmitted between generations of victims, as we see being very popular claim amongst, for example, the movements in North America, in the United States, whether it be through the Black rights movements or even the Native American rights movements that are claiming their post-generational traumas that they are inheriting, but it's not okay for a Jew. The conversation actually continued as another member declared, how is it possible this woman can blame her problems on supposed experiences of her parents in the Holocaust? It's all just made up anyway. So whereas we have the most highly documented historical event of human atrocity, man-on-man atrocity, it's already taken such a leap in the social acceptance of denial in every different form, that now we can say the stories of the Holocaust are just made up, and that is not, it's not arousing response in any massive way. If we have an increase in Holocaust education all around the world, we should be seeing an increase in the amount of responses to such random use of the Holocaust for abusive purposes, but we don't. We hear silence. Another one, by the way, in the same dialogue, had called this woman the grammar Nazi, using the exact terms, and then in the dialogue said that she must have learned well from her great-grandparents who were themselves accomplices with the Nazis. So there's all sorts of distortions that we're seeing taking place. And the last example from this encounter that I was involved in, how anyone can be taken seriously, saying something triggered her trauma that she claimed was from caused only by the Holocaust, is only something Jews believe they have a right to do. So now it quickly deteriorates. Invariably, these discussions deteriorate into otherwise anti-Semitic expressions, more often than not, including both traditional and modern expressions of hate. So Jewish members, meaning they incorporate modern politics, current partisanship, other issues that they might feel relate to and can be pushed into the same dialogue with all of the venting and vigilance that they would like. Jewish members of these groups are silenced, mostly into submission. Hate spreads like wildfire, but more importantly, so does misinformation, indifference, and the accepted use of the Holocaust in some abusive form, but it is apologetic, because at the core, the abuse is often involving Jews themselves. But also the abuse of the Jew is something that has to be silenced in and of itself. just like the Jewish right to emotion and sympathy or Jewish memory. So the Jew has become privileged, white, thieving, power-hungry perverts of society, the murderous, demonic, genocidal Jew state. These are the trends that were similar to the negative depictions and fabricated accusations against Jews, which created the environment for the Holocaust to occur in the first place. So now everyone wants to say that what we're witnessing happening today with the rise of anti-Semitism is the red light, that this is another Holocaust coming. And yet that can be pulled in any single direction that one would like. It isn't one leader, not one president, not one politician, one group, one faction of society. It is literally everywhere. And more, the silenced party is the party being victimized, not only the living Jew, but the dead Jew, the Jew of the Holocaust. Their murder is being silenced for its truth so that it can feel more easily comparable with other things happening in a contemporary reality. In such a situation, people are left confused. Some ashamed. They don't know how to answer. They then hide into themselves. They don't want to share with anybody else that this happened. Many feel fear, or maybe they feel disgust. And unfortunately, we also see that there's an increased hate of anything that has to do with a public Jewish identity. That's true, by the way, for Jews and for non-Jews. It's true whether it be for the Holocaust, Israel, or any public Jewish expression. A whole generation of Jews is being confronted head on with the tension between the universalist principles that we have really embraced for many decades, and the idea that there is a legitimate and virtuous Jewish particularity, something that is beneficial not only to the Jews as a people, but actually to all of mankind, if the particularity of Jews and their experience, both during the Holocaust and the patterns of hate throughout history, were to be recognized for their own sake, for their own virtue. The idea that Jews have special obligations one to the other, that we had any unique experience of suffering, that we had a right to defend ourselves in these particularities needs to be retained. And part of that is going to begin when we try to retain the integrity of the Holocaust, not only as history, but as human experience and memory as it gets transmitted continuously to the future. You know, we've continued to survive and thrive for 3,000 years, in spite of every tyranny that has tried to destroy us. Perhaps this is the Jewish power that echoes the Nazi propaganda, promoting fear of the Jew, the eternal threat. Well, Jewish sovereignty is again a reality, and the texts that were written during the history of our victimization, like during the Holocaust, well, they're all open to speculation. Accusations of Jews or Israel as the evil of the world now once again have free reign, because at the end of the day, the Jew likely exaggerated or lied, while at the root of it all, the Jew is the primary slave owner, and the Jew is and the accusations continue to grow, and they may fester silently. You don't hear them, but they are all around us. And unfortunately, in society, people believe, well, if I didn't experience it, then it must not be so bad. But what is happening in the microcosm on campuses shouldn't be only analyzed within that realm. It needs to be realized that it's affecting us everywhere. What was happening on campuses and what is happening on campuses now is happening in classrooms and even amongst family members, because the idea is to divide ourselves, to divide the Jews between the differing opinions. It helps us to be able to use the Holocaust for our unique and personal desires as much as we might like. It paves the way, so to speak. So this brings about a secondary effect of the universalization of the Holocaust, which is the affirmation of Holocaust revisionist conspiracy theories. Okay, for example, when asked if the Holocaust was a hoax, Amazon's Alexa unit replies, according to a study, categorically that some claim the Holocaust is a hoax or an exaggeration arising from a deliberate Jewish conspiracy designed to advance the interest of Jews at the expense of other people. Alexa states it as fact. It has been reported that Alexa's responses also include Jews control the world's financial systems and media. Israel is guilty. Ethnic cleansing on a massive scale and serial human rights abuse, including war crimes, are amongst Israel's top contributions to the world. These are some facts being offered, or rather, shall we say, these are biased opinions being offered as facts, but to the random listener of Amazon's Alexa, you wouldn't know the difference. Is it reasonable that this information should be so automated that essentially any individual can be exposed to the idea that the Jew harbors evil intent towards all of mankind? What is our course of action? What can we do? The spread of lies is actually so massive. The real question is whether or not it can ever be contained. The use of the Holocaust has found a place in literally every single social media platform, but because the number of people advocating for truth in Holocaust history are so small, you will never be able to counter the ripple effect of all of the hate that is spreading. And I mean not only hate against Jews, but even hate of the Holocaust and emerging from a learning of the Holocaust. The use of the Holocaust has now become part of personal encounters in education and politics, and the idea of Jews exploiting the Holocaust as an excuse for alleged Israeli aggression, but more importantly, the known systematic Jewish racism, because the Jews are white. Because of course, once you eliminate 3,000 years of Jewish history, just as you're trying to eliminate the Jewish experience during the Holocaust, the Jew is now stripped of the fact that its origins deny the exact accusations being imposed upon Jews of all ages who have no idea how to respond. And the voices that are out there as these activists are accused of being propaganda, much as I'm sure after the fact, even my own words can be used against me as so-called Jewish propaganda or Jewish privilege. We all know that the campuses, as I said, they're the hotbed. And the whole of academia is actually compliant in allowing the libels to spread. For example, there's a master's thesis that claims that Holocaust education serves to obscure Jewish privilege, deny Jewish racism at its core, and promote the interests of the genocidal Jewish Israeli nation state. Charges that claims of Jewish victimhood are no longer based in a reality of oppression, but continue to be propagated through a victimized Jewish identity. So now the Holocaust is being used to accuse the Jews of being victims in the Holocaust. And the only goal, of course, according to this academic report, is beneficial to the organized Jewish community around the world who seeks globalization and world domination. It is as if we are reading the protocols of the elders of Zion all over again. It is only, nearly 100 years later, over 100 years later. Jews are so often accused, actually, of co-opting anti-Semitism to fend off criticism of Israel, that contemporary anti-Semitism is deemed by some to be a myth or excusable. How do Israel and the Jews love using anti-Semitism for their own purposes? Let me count the ways. These are the memes that you can see circulating on Instagram. Of course, TikTok has a whole variety of little videos. You can see it everywhere. The question is are we? Because I'm not. I'm not an avid platform visitor of all the platforms out there. I looked on Clubhouse for a moment and was so appalled. And who can fathom the overstimulation of the amount of hate and waxing philosophical that is being done by the hate mongers and fear mongers who are simply accusing others of it so that they can get away with the behavior themselves. Under the guise of searching for ways to improve the world, the Jews who are involved in many of the social justice movements in these platforms and in real life are advocating in every way for the rights of all people and themselves using the Holocaust to advance their agenda. The rights of Jews, unfortunately, do not count amongst their amongst their goals of what is deserving. The Holocaust, continuously co-opted through this universal slant, is that the comparison with other events is the only way to uncover a truth behind this global Jewish agenda. What's the ultimate question asked by yet another academic? Is it an irresponsible overstatement to associate the treatment of Palestinians in Gaza with the Jewish criminalized Nazi record of a collective atrocity? If that is a sentence that makes sense to most people, you are lucky. For others, it simply sounds like such a collection of genius words, it must make sense. It does not. And once again, the learner, the listener has absolutely no idea how to respond other than to assume that the pattern of conduct on behalf of Jews in Israel, their soldier or their government, is a Holocaust in the making. This represents our desperate appeal to public opinion to claim genocidal tendencies, even though every shred of fact proves otherwise. What is the problem? In the cancel culture of today, facts simply don't matter. The lie is easier to believe, especially when it's promoted by Jews themselves, especially by a survivor or their descendants. Then certainly it must be true. And if a teacher in a classroom who's teaching the Holocaust, well, he must have some base of knowledge. So if he's making the comparison, then he must know what he's talking about. He must be sharing with me a truth, not the truth, is the fundamental problem of how Holocaust history not only is being abused in contemporary society, but actually will be continuously abused unless we do more to curb its tendencies. Extreme leftist professors, one in particular, has claimed that Israel uses Holocaust education to prepare its youngsters for the task of brutalizing the Palestinians. Others have claimed that Jews use Holocaust education to prepare the world for understanding how the Jew is a danger to the world and Hitler was right. I don't understand the logic myself, but again, the way it gets presented is believable as long as it goes along with the syllabus of the pages you must read on these websites. It doesn't matter the source of the website, doesn't matter the source of the article that is being shared. The lie, the distortion, the misinformation, that has become the actual history being passed along. The truth of history is being left to the ashes. It carries much more weight when these leaders and when the leaders of movements are making these statements, when politicians are making these statements. It is emotive. It arouses sympathy. The idea that no matter how many generals, soldiers, and yes, even Arabs in Israel, Judea, Samaria, even Gaza themselves will deny the lies, the disconnect around the world of Jews and Israel, it feeds the continued use of the Holocaust as a divisive element and a point on which the Jew of the diaspora can say, no, that's not me. Or the anti-Zionist can say, no, it's not these, all Jews, it's these Jews. So we're seeing this conflict happening again and again, and it is almost always arousing sympathy for the victim, hatred for the oppressor, with the use of the Holocaust as the uber comparative lens. And that almost is Holocaust education to blame. Holocaust education done not right, or Holocaust history passed along in too universalized or too clean of a method. I'll tell you the most recently, I'm sure many of you saw a Jewish news anchor targeted a fellow reporter for likening Dr. Fauci's attempts to curb the spread of the COVID pandemic to Nazi doctor Joseph Mengele, the doctor of Auschwitz, who infamously performed medical experiments and most on children and on others, and whose white gloved hands direct millions left, right to their death. The illegitimate comparison is one of many that have become popular in social dialogue, and we see it time and time again, and it is couched in the use of this rhetoric by journalists and by politicians and leaders. Ocasio-Cortez, Bill Clinton, the Pope. They have called Serbian holding pens for Muslim Bosnians, described as the same term in China and Gaza as concentration camps. Anti-abortion activists refer to abortions as the Holocaust of the unborn. Gun rights activists use the Holocaust as an excuse to advocate for liberalizing gun laws even further. President Trump compared American intelligence agencies to those of the Third Reich, while the left accused Trump of being the new Hitler. Left-wing figures invoked Nazism in reference to George Bush, while Natalie Portman compared meat-eating humans to Nazis. And of course, the countless BDSniks and the other anti-Zionists have been saying or implying for decades the hideous slander of Israel as the modern Nazi state. So as unfathomable as this may sound to some people, Trump is not Hitler, Fauci is not Mengele, and the comparisons must stop. Only no one knows how to stop them. Is policing the right answer? Because that, in many environments around the world, in many places around the world, is actually increasing anti-Semitism, increasing hatred. So we've really created for ourselves a conundrum. By highlighting the Holocaust as the ultimate example of man's capacity for evil, it became the yardstick by which all evil should be measured. So now, whenever someone wants to identify a person or any idea as evil, the Holocaust, that provides the grounds for comparison, in spite of no commonalities between the contexts or even their details. Jews, they respond in outrage at times when they feel it is inappropriate, but the echoes of silence are deafening. No Jewish resistance to the comparative trends may ever matter in the grand scope of the future. So in fact, perhaps we may have created this challenge for ourselves, but we could also discover some of the ways that we could impact the future. Holocaust trivialization, unfortunately, is now in schools. That is an avenue where the common family, the common individual can make a difference. In the very places that are now mandated to have Holocaust curriculum, any teacher can teach it, no training is required, no background understanding, and no standard of truth. Everything is open to interpretation, so that recently I was told that the question for an essay was, did the Jews deserve their persecution during the Holocaust? Transformative for any youth who has to face such a question. Just as the Holocaust was supposed to be a way to teach about our understanding of humankind's darkest impulses, that the Holocaust could teach the next generation to learn hard truths, to inherit pain and memory. Well, now we are seeing that the protection of the dignity of its victims is being cast aside entirely, almost to the point of the blaming of the Jews for the Holocaust having occurred, and in commonplace conversation, blaming Jews today for having to talk about the Holocaust at all. Many schools around the world now include the Holocaust, of course, as mandated in their curriculum. Teachers who should be trained, they don't want to overly traumatize, so everything is very, cleaned up and presented in a way that they make it ill-equipped to cope with what's the result. Because alongside learning about the Holocaust and the Nazis, as we know from Melbourne and other places that we've heard stories of, a 5-year-old boy was subjected to such horrific bullying and intimidation by classmates who called him Jewish vermin, the dirty Jew, Jewish cockroach. A 12-year-old boy surrounded by 9 kids who threatened beatings if he didn't kiss the feet of a Muslim boy in their class. In Indiana, a girl's locker etched with, "Why didn't you go to the gas with the rest of the Jew swine?" In France, England, Canada, New York, LA, you name it. It's happening. And what we once believed would stop Jew hatred has now become the primary slur. The Jews are the blame for the ills of the world, the hindrance to peace among all men, the stranger amongst us, the eternal other, different in so many ways that they are not even welcome in an intersectionality-driven society. They have succeeded in making the Holocaust and the Auschwitz the rallying cry for yet another elimination of the Jews from the world and even from memory. These are the realities paving the way for the more recent demands of the other side of the Holocaust story to be represented alongside the sharing of Holocaust history. No longer is it just the stories of the non-Jewish victims. No, now it's also the perpetrators themselves. We have to humanize them. We have to understand their motivations and any modern manifestation that one thinks fits the mold. Hence, essay questions in high schools. Please explain why Hitler believed he was right. Now you can analyze the question. You could even ask a similar goal that you want the student to explain, but using more careful wording so that we can understand the intention of the educational lesson itself. But unfortunately, these lessons usually constitute nothing more than a few hours, very generalized, sanitized, of the pain, the horror, and the relevance of the unique treatment of Jews, because it is the particular persecution of Jews during the Holocaust that actually is the bulwark for a human understanding of repeated patterns in human behavior. It is not to be generalized. It should not to be generalized. You know, Elie Wiesel once said about the Holocaust, one should take off one's shoes when entering its domain. We should tremble each time one pronounces the word. Ever faithful to his Jewish origins and values, his concern about their universality, which certainly was important in his efforts in fighting for human rights for all people. He did possess limits, and it's a lesson that we should all take into serious consideration, because it was years later that he proclaimed, I cannot use the word Holocaust anymore. First, because there are no words, and also because it has become so trivialized that I cannot use it anymore to describe what it was intended to describe. Whatever mishap occurs now, it is a Holocaust. A commentator describing the defeat of a sports team somewhere called it a Holocaust, a description of the murder of 6 people, and the author called it a Holocaust. So I have no words anymore. Well, it is in the absence of Elie Wiesel that we, the next generation of protectors of memories and truth, we must find the words. And only by addressing the value of the particularity of the Jewish experience and the history of the Holocaust can we offer a way forward psychologically as well as logistically to confront this endless universalization and the abuse of Holocaust history. We must teach others how to protect the integrity of the history by avoiding distortions, illegitimate parallels, and applying the many lessons one can learn about human behavior while couching them in the reality in which they were experienced: decision-making, leadership, responsibility towards one's fellow man, all without minimizing the truth of that dark realm, that universe of hell, which defies our imaginations and our nightmares, even as it defied that of those who were forced to endure its reality. Nobody likes to think about genocide. Nobody wants to think about the Holocaust or any other mass killing. They are uncomfortable with the fact that these events happen, and most absolutely could not state even a single fact about the atrocities themselves. Without a real effort to retain their memory, the Holocaust, the voice of the survivors, the meaning for humanity, it may simply disappear from history. And if we are not careful, and if we do not act in our communities, in our schools, in our families, in our homes, in our houses of prayer, we are going to see a continued deterioration of the use and abuse of the Holocaust until it no longer resembles any truth at all. And this is a task for all of us. So I've tried to highlight for you tonight the wide spectrum of issues. And I am sure that you have many more that you have experienced or that you have heard of, and that you have many challenges that you face in situations you might have found yourself succumbing to the silence. The question is how do we act from here? And so I thank you for giving me the opportunity to highlight some of this contemporary problem that we face and the challenge that it represents for us as we try to build for the future.
Thank you so much, Elana, wow, you packed a lot into that 40 minutes, I would say, and I think there's probably a lot to unpack, but thank you for first leading us into this topic. Let me just, I've got a strange thing on my screen here, but I know that a couple of people have already posed questions. I want to just invite other people to type in any questions they have in the Q&A window. I also have some questions, but maybe I could start with a question of my own, which is about just, can you give us a sense about how different is what's going on today with historical looking back at how the Holocaust has been viewed? Is there really something that's different now about the current abuse of the history that's different than 30 years ago or 20 years ago?
Absolutely. I would say that, first of all, you see a huge shift in the use of the Holocaust with the birth of the Holocaust Museum becoming a public institution in the United States. It's also raised, the establishment of the museum also raised a very serious conflict within the Jewish community and for its major spearheading leader, Elie Wiesel himself, because he was in a position where he was forced to step down from the museum because of the push to keep the message of the museum as universal as possible. He was so against it that he left the board that he made happen. He made that museum possible, and unfortunately he recognized these patterns already. You're talking 30, well over 30 years ago. In education, I would say you're talking in the last 20 years, and I think that the issue of the slur of Nazi and Holocaust as a joke and those types of things, those are more in the last decade. Why do I think these things have happened? I believe they go simultaneous, right side by side with the humanizing of terrorism and terrorists. We see with the Second Intifada, for example, all of a sudden, terror against Jews is increasingly legitimized, and it's done so through that emotional charge. So that then triggered some discussion in classrooms and on campuses, which we're now seeing the result of 30 years, 20, 30 years later. There's no truth anymore. It's all subjective. It is, even if you try to state a truth, you are automatically countered with a lie, but in a screaming fashion. So this is another element we have to see has changed. The violence. It is not only in college campuses, that's what we see in the news, but it is in high schools. It is now in middle schools. The violence between just in the words that children are exchanging between themselves. And by the way, I don't want to tell you that it's only in one place and only in one population. It's here in Israel too. It's everywhere, that it's just kind of, we're so desensitized, this young generation, that you can really say anything. So definitely, I would say it has changed dramatically over these decades. And I think that we are at an apex, that we're at a climax, but it can get worse. It will get worse, frankly, I believe. And the only way it will change is, I believe, if the masses of people who have rallied behind Holocaust memory never again will use their voice to proclaim a need for, I don't want to say standardization, because that then becomes systematic. And we're being accused of systematic brainwashing about the Holocaust in order to advance Jewish interests. So, we're at a problem of language as much as of emotion and a lack of logic. Everything is logical today. Everybody has their truth. So I think it's changed. It's going to continue to change. I also think I want to answer the first part of your question, which is, how is it different than even before the Holocaust? Is very important that we recognize that no one knows when the Holocaust begins So what is before the Holocaust? The murder that begins in 1939 wasn't the beginning of the Holocaust. So if nobody can say when it starts, nobody can then be more cautious with how it's applied. So I think that if you look at the right after World War I and the early phases in Germany, what happens in society, how does the rhetoric become more socially acceptable? What was happening there in the course of 3 years is happening today in the course of 3 weeks, 3 months, because of social media and shall we say, propaganda's entrance, acceptable entrance into academic and learning environments.
You know, what you say about the impact of the opening of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum as a kind of a beginning, and the fact that as people learn, as the general American population learned more about the Holocaust, it became used in a more general way. That highlights one of the real challenges here. And this is a question that somebody asked as well, which you've just talked about, but I want to just push it more. The person writes, what is the solution? How do we get people to stop appropriating, for lack of a better word, the Holocaust, including misuse of the word Nazi, as in grammar Nazi, feminist Nazi, soup Nazi, whatever. So you're saying we need to, there needs to be, on the one hand, more regulation of who's teaching the Holocaust. Is that what I'm understanding?
It's about who's teaching the Holocaust. It's how it's a standard for what are the basic parameters that do not allow for the many forms of Holocaust revision, distortion, trivialization. So when we learn in schools on certain historical subjects, let's say that they're learned according to curriculums in a box. Now we all know you cannot put the Holocaust in a box, and every teacher and educator is going to teach it in their own way. But there should be boundaries, a form of boundaries of what is just off limits out of pure respect to the victims. And I will say, you want to say, there are educators out there who say you have to teach about the perpetrators. You have to humanize the Nazis. You have to. We can't control that. So if you're going to humanize a Nazi, okay, let's say we're going to take that track, because we do want to understand that the Nazis were normal people. They were not beasts. They were common individuals who get empowered through many different strains. How does the process grow from the National Socialist Democrats to to becoming a murderous Nazi? And now here we are that everybody's a Nazi. So, I think that it's very important that people feel, number one, capable to come up with we live in a generation where if it's like more than 30 seconds, nobody will pay attention. So you have to come up with your one-liner response when you are hearing something, but most people aren't hearing it, or maybe they're scrolling through it on their feed. Nobody wants to take the time and get outraged. We're all exhausted. So I believe that a proactive effort is always what's needed. So in every community, let's say there's one parent, and in their community, they start a conversation and they don't put Holocaust in the title. Maybe it's about the abuse of history, and you invite people to come, but the topic is about the Holocaust. Or maybe you promote a local gathering, a virtual gathering, and instead of it being only through a museum, it is simply a group of parents and grandparents who, wow, I don't know what to do. I heard about this, and how would you respond? And maybe we can get some of our book club members to join the conversation. We want to go back I'm going to sound funny here, but in a way, go back to the old world. Local, small, intimate community impact has a huge ripple effect. That's how we can go into our schools. That's how we can talk to the teachers. Go to the teachers who are teaching the Holocaust. Ask them what they are focusing on. What is their end goal? And are they protecting the integrity of what was the Holocaust in its own truth? not in the truth of the way it's been distorted today. I do think that also we have to say what do you see asking teachers, what are you asking your students to learn? I'm very big on reflective education practice. And I think that we forget to ask ourselves those questions sometimes, especially in a Corona world. We're all very overprogrammed. So if we're doing it more one-on-one, more small, intimate, and local initiatives, then connecting those local initiatives, finding each other, like the homeschooling networks that have grown, especially over the last decade, there are ways that grassroots impact can really be made.
Yeah, so really you're calling for a bottom-up movement and encouraging people out there who are watching right now to think, what can I do? Well, you can go have a meeting with some teachers, have a meeting with other parents, and impact what's being done in your school. So you're really calling for that.
A friend of mine recently wrote an article about a movie that unfortunately has become like the movie of Holocaust education. Okay. The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. And I don't know for those of you who haven't seen it, but it is absolutely revision of truth. And yet, I believe there are over 193 schools that I was able to track down that are using this in their curriculum. So let's say that there's a parent who knows their student is in whichever grade it becomes, because it's changing in different states in the United States. It's in different places in every country in the world. Find out what they're learning. I wrote an incredible resource. I helped a school in New York get night back on the curriculum because it was taken off for the sake of Boy in the Striped Pajamas. We are stripping the truth and replacing it with fiction. And there is a severe danger if those of us who are concerned about it don't raise our voice more.
Let me raise a couple of the other questions that have come in. One person writes, do you think that the desensitization to tragedies and violence that people can experience also plays a role in the way people talk about the Holocaust today? Like there's a kind of general desensitization to tragedy, and that affects how people view the Holocaust.
Absolutely. And then there goes another question of, well, how do we curb that? You can't resensitize a whole society. There is a philosopher, I'm going to forget who it was, a philosopher who writes, and even, I would have to say Camus for the readers out there, touches on it. The idea of how do you reform whole societies and ways of thought? And sometimes the only way is for another atrocity to take place. And isn't that a sad commentary that we actually have to witness? Now, what has happened? There has been atrocity after atrocity since the Holocaust. Nothing has changed. Even Elie Wiesel himself said, we all believed that the anti-Semitism would disappear with Auschwitz, but it didn't. It's only become exacerbated by Auschwitz. So there is something fundamentally wrong with the absent parts of the conversations that we are having. There's the things nobody wants to discuss. And sometimes, as I mentioned, I think that they're being extracted because let's not talk, that's too Jewish. We shouldn't talk about that with non-Jews, or let's not talk about Jewish issues because our viewers, and I get this a lot, Israel Forever, for example, our materials are open for use by any population, but they are written with the integrity of Jewish rights, Jewish identity, and Jewish experience, Jewish history. I think that we have to stop apologizing for it. And I think when it comes to the Holocaust, that is essential. I actually see here the next question, a question about the Holocaust as a joke, okay, as whether or not it's able to be used against us. Absolutely, because Nazi became popularized as a common slur by the soup Nazi on Seinfeld, and Seinfeld's a Jew, and there was the whole episode of Jews being able to say that because they're Curb Your Enthusiasm, you name it, there's a comedian out there who has said it. So humor actually during the Holocaust was a very fascinating element of survival. It's a whole other area of discussion. But what are we seeing? Humor is now being manipulated also against us. So yeah, I can tell you that factual statements are being extracted and taken out of context very easily. And in the world of the internet, what are we going to, we're going to police everybody, because then we are the Jewish Nazis they're claiming us to be. See that line right there? Imagine somebody takes that out right there.
Right. I mean, we know this is going on, where people take videos, edit somebody, whether it's a presidential candidate, a president, whoever, and can now edit it and change videos and make changes so it sounds like somebody is saying one thing when they said something completely different. But there's no way, you're saying there's no way to stop that.
It's not that I don't believe there's a way to stop it. I think that the ways that do exist to stop it, unfortunately, have their own existing partisan bias, shall we say, or social justice slant, shall we say. And so they are suffering the same ills as Holocaust history, that they are not finding a way to police across the spectrum. You might be tagged for anything you say against an Arab, Islam, but you can say anything about a Jew or Israel. You can, so, you know, is there a way? Increased policing is not the answer if it's done in a systematic method by fact checkers who are going to, I don't know if it's happened to you, but very often on Facebook, for example, will share information, and I will have factual details shared will be taken off of Facebook for being misinformation. So we have to counter it. If you go into Wikipedia and you search, you will find random references where it has been edited, because Wikipedia can be edited by anybody. You will find places where random bits have been added that distort the facts, that distort the message towards usually an anti-Zionist, anti-Israel agenda. Or again, the global universalized comparisons that we're seeing, those types of things, that's somebody that what I call an armchair activist can do. You know, you're at home. I have a dear, dear friend who's unfortunately many years, you know, she's very much at home with an illness. And so she spends all of her time researching on Quora and on Reddit and finding places these conversations are happening where she can report them, or she can counter them. I have no idea how she has the strength to do it. I personally, and I've been an activist all my years, but it's exhausting and it is painful. And we are in every response that is emotionally charged, by the way, it only feeds the hate further. So we need to make sure that everybody has facts in their pocket and strength and courage through which they can find their voice to speak.
We are running out of time, but I want to emphasize a couple of things here, which I think your message is so powerful. Is your message is one of empowerment to us, to the viewer, to say we can do what, or we should be doing what we can to counter this on an individual basis. When we hear what our students are being taught in school, when we hear somebody in an elevator, we should be empowered to use our voice to defend the historical accuracy. And
I want to suggest that even if you hear of it happening somewhere else, turn to a teacher, turn to a community leader, say, here's something that's happening elsewhere. How do we prevent this from happening in our community? How can we do more? The Holocaust has lessons for everybody. And we have an obligation to teach them, but if we strip them of their depth, we are teaching nothing. And then we are truly forgetting the dead again. And that is a shame.
Well, that might be a good way to finish. I thank you so much for sharing this and for empowering us to go out and use our voices. And I thank all of you for watching today. And I look forward to joining you at other programs soon. Thank you very much, Elana.
Thank you so much for having me.
Take care, everybody. Thank you.